Jonathan looked at his life through the lens of one big milestone. He had almost reached the end of his career, and all that remained was to prepare for a well-deserved rest. He had always believed that old age should be a time of peace, joy, and reminiscing about years of hard work. His friends had already begun to gradually retire, but Jonathan wanted this not just for himself, but for his loved ones as well. He believed that time for rest was a time for new opportunities, for traveling, for living without the pressure of debt and daily worries. For this reason, Jonathan worked for many years at a local bank. He was a man who valued stability, and although his salary was not very high, he always had a plan. Every month, he put a portion of his salary into a retirement account without thinking about anything else. A few people knew about his saving habits. He was proud that he was able to save a large sum for his old age, and as that moment approached, Jonathan felt confident. His wife, Sarah, had always supported him in all his endeavors. They had raised 2 children together, and now that they were adults, Jonathan dreamed of traveling and spending time together with Sarah. They even thought about a house by the lake where they could spend all the summer months enjoying the peace and nature. All these plans seemed so real, but something began to change. Although Jonathan couldn't quite put his finger on it, he noticed that Sarah was changing her behavior. She began to stay late at work more, sometimes having to take extra nights on site, which was unusual. She didn't ask him about his plans, didn't mention their shared dreams, and that worried Jonathan. Maybe it's just my imagination, he thought, trying to convince himself that everything would be fine. But his heart told him otherwise. However, serious changes began to appear when Jonathan received his bank statement. At first glance, everything looked normal, but a few large transactions caught his attention. He saw debits he hadn't expected for expensive purchases, hotel stays he'd never paid attention to. The statement looked like he might have lost control of what was happening with their money. It can't be true, Sarah. He thought, but he couldn't find an explanation that would calm his heart. It seemed as if everything he had built over the years was simply crumbling before his eyes. Jonathan began to worry. He had always believed that money in the family should be clearly divided and under control. However, there was uncertainty here. He didn't want to believe that this was happening to his family, but every day he felt more and more that someone close to him was manipulating his trust. What is happening to us? Why did this happen now? He asked himself, trying to figure out if he should talk to Sarah or if he should leave it alone. His heart was filled with many emotions: sadness, disappointment, and even anger, because he had worked all his life to secure their future. What had happened now? Why did it all feel like an undercurrent that he failed to notice? It got even worse when they started talking about their future plans. Jonathan tried to discuss with Sarah their plans for retirement, how they would spend time together, what places they wanted to visit. But her response lacked the warmth he had once felt. Sarah was just silent, which made him even more worried. Jonathan began to feel that they were on the verge of some drastic changes. He began to wonder again if it would make sense to see a financial advisor. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But then, why the strange expenses? Why had Sarah become so distant? He began to suspect that something more was going on than just normal financial difficulties. He didn't know what it was, but his heart told him that they were getting close to something big. Jonathan's retirement account had been his pride, but now it had become his greatest fear. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he felt that his life could end in an instant. His dreams of a peaceful old age, of traveling, of spending time with Sarah began to disappear. Even if he tried to resume these plans, he would not be the same man he was before. Can betrayal really be forgiven? Is it possible to start over after such a trust has been broken? Jonathan realized that this situation would force him to reconsider not only his finances, but his entire family identity. Only time would tell if he would be able to regain what seemed like such an important part of his life. Jonathan had been worried about what was happening to his family for weeks. Not so long ago he felt confident about his future, but now everything has changed. Sarah, his wife, was becoming more and more distant, and these strange expenses on his bank statements were making him feel helpless. But he had one important rule: don't panic, don't jump to conclusions. All these doubts just had to be sorted out. Every morning when Jonathan woke up, he tried not to think about it. He sat down to breakfast, where Sarah was ready to talk, but always chose neutral topics. They no longer shared their plans for retirement, and even normal conversations began to become shorter and less emotional. Maybe it's just the stress of moving to a new job, he thought, trying to justify her behavior. Maybe I'm just too sensitive. But if that's the case, why did her face become so indifferent? Sarah no longer laughed when Jonathan made jokes, and this bothered him greatly. And then one morning, when Jonathan decided to start a conversation, he was surprised when Sarah asked without looking at him, "Did you see how I registered our data on the financial portal for retirement?" "Yes, I saw it. But why didn't you show me what you changed in the settings?" he asked, knowing that this was an important step for Sarah. "I thought you didn't want to do it. You always give it to me, and I just wanted to do it so I wouldn't bother you," Sarah replied, her voice clearly stressed. "Did you change any settings?" asked Jonathan, growing more and more suspicious. Well, I just updated the addresses and contacts for handling inquiries. That's all," she said, looking away slightly. Jonathan realized that something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. However, he could already sense that these small changes could be significant. A few days later, Jonathan checked his bank statement again and saw something that was bothering him. It turned out that one of the transactions was labeled as other expenses, with no explanation. The amount was significant, and it was not related to any of their usual expenses. Jonathan knew that his money in the account was under his control, and now something was telling him that it wasn't. He couldn't let this go unchecked, and he had to act, and he decided to talk to Sarah frankly, not waiting for her to manipulate the situation again. After work, when Jonathan got home, he tried to bring up the subject again. This time, however, Sarah seemed to be even more distant than before. "Sarah, what's going on? You changed your address on the financial portal, and I saw that the expenses are not at all in line with what we had planned," he began, trying to keep his cool. But Sarah just sighed and said, "You know what I'm doing." I'm just thinking about the future. We need to be prepared for all kinds of changes, John." Her voice sounded indifferent, and that was even more disturbing. Jonathan felt that the more he tried to find out, the more she tried to push him away. That day was critical. Jonathan felt that he could no longer put these questions aside. He was not a naive man who had worked for stability all his life and tried to plan for his future. He decided that he would do whatever it took to keep control of the situation. He contacted the bank to find out more about the unexplained transactions. But what he learned made him hold his breath. He didn't know if he was ready for what he was about to hear. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jonathan, but there were no errors on your account. All of these charges are related to your family," the bank employee said. "We can give you the details, but it seems to be a matter between you and your family." Now he knew he had to follow through. Something was up, and Jonathan realized that he needed more than just confirmation from the bank. He needed to understand if there were real motives behind these changes, or if they were just small cracks that would eventually lead to a bigger break. Sarah was no longer the woman he once loved, and this decision was in front of him as if it was his last chance to understand why he was still in this situation. Was it just an innocent change, or had someone else long taken over what Jonathan thought was his life's achievement? Jonathan could feel his nerves gradually giving out. He tried to stay calm, but each new day brought more doubts, and his own surroundings looked more and more suspicious. He heard quiet whispers in his head that were getting louder. what's really going on with your money. Even you don't know the whole truth, Jonathan. But even with all this, he couldn't overcome the fear that maybe everything that was happening now was just his paranoia. The morning began as usual for Jonathan. Hutton at a breakfast, the newspaper, a few careless glances at his phone. But when he reopened the bank's app, his eyes settled on a number he'd seen before. The same amount he couldn't explain. This time, however, he noticed another detailing the transaction was labeled personal payment for family. This immediately made his heart jump. Jonathan knew that no one in the family had accessed his account without his permission. Why hadn't he seen this before? Perhaps it was money that, accidentally, went to another person's account, or worse, someone was using his name for financial fraud. But who and why? Thoughts began to spin in his head, and he couldn't stop thinking. Sarah had always been so cautious, even meticulous, especially when it came to finances. This was starting to look more and more like a scam, but why would Sarah want to mess with his money? Was it possible that he was so deeply involved in her manipulations that he could no longer see the truth? That he gathered his strength and called Sarah. His voice was firm, but he still sounded undisguisedly anxious. "Sarah, I need you to explain one thing. I saw another transaction. It was labeled as a payment for family. Do you know about it?" "Nah." Sarah was already home by then, and her reaction was unexpected. She started to speak, but her speech was vague and fast, as if she was trying to avoid the topic. Yes, I did make it, but it was a payment we discussed to help your sister, Jonathan." "Have you forgotten?" she said, trying to keep her explanation on the surface, but his inner intuition screamed that it wasn't true. We never discussed anything like this, Sarah. And you know I don't support this style of spending." He felt his nerves on edge. Sarah was silent, but then adding, "I thought it would be best for all of us. I thought that there would be no more questions. But I guess I messed up, didn't I?" Jonathan didn't believe what she said, but he didn't want to make any hasty decisions. He decided to take his investigation one step further, because this was looking like more than just a misunderstanding. He knew that perhaps the biggest danger was that he had never paid attention to these little things until it was too late. He decided to contact a financial advisor who could help him track all the transactions. Perhaps this step would help him unravel the situation, or at least understand what was really going on. When the consultant checked the account, he provided Jonathan with some strange facts, unexplained money transfers with no clear purpose, which looked like fake payments made under other people's names. All of these funds seemed to be sent to be processed by other companies that Jonathan did not know. "This is something out of the ordinary, Jonathan. Someone may be using your financial resources without your knowledge," the consultant said. "We can do a more detailed check, but it will take more time." Jonathan began to realize that what was happening to his account and his family was just the beginning of something much bigger. Sarah was probably not to blame for everything, but someone in his life was clearly manipulating his finances. And even if he felt powerless, this was his chance to regain control of his situation. He was beginning to wonder who else might be involved in this network of manipulation. How long had this been going on, and why hadn't he noticed anything before? What kind of future awaited him when all these invisible threats finally came to light? Although he tried to reassure himself, uncertainty grew inside him. Who is really his enemy in this situation? Should he continue his investigation, or was it too dangerous? Jonathan sat in his office, surrounded by printed documents, bank statements, and all the records he had collected over the past few days. He began to realize that whoever was behind this invisible threat might be much closer than he thought. And this thought scared him even more. Is there still a chance to understand who is really behind all this? He thought as he reached for his phone, ready to make another call. All of Jonathan's thoughts converged on one thing: something was wrong, and it couldn't be a simple coincidence. And as he dug into his records and financial reports, he began to feel an invisible threat hovering over him. The shadows of his family, which had previously seemed perfectly normal, were now taking on an airy appearance. He knew he had to find out the truth, even if it was painful. Step by step, he found more and more evidence that it was not just a coincidence. He felt that he was in for an unpleasant surprise, and he even realized that the answer could be horrifying. After he received confirmation from his financial advisor about the anomalous transactions, Jonathan decided to act decisively. And his fear and frustration began to turn into anger, but he couldn't afford to panic. He needed a cool head and a clear strategy. He decided to turn to bank records that he hadn't even realized were worth checking. It all started with very small and seemingly insignificant payments, but each of them turned out to be connected to strangers. Another payment, this time to his older sister Lisa. Jonathan knew she had no access to his accounts. But again, the amount looked too suspicious. Each new suspicion was like an invisible thread that tied Jonathan to this mystery. In the end, he turned to the bank itself with a request for a more detailed check of all transactions. As it turned out, the list contained significant transfers, even larger than the ones he had noticed earlier. A few days later, Jonathan received a message from the bank. He was getting tired of the inquiries and alarming calls, but what he learned was an eye-opener. The transactions, seemingly normal at first glance, were fake. They all went from his account to new accounts that he was not familiar with. And worst of all, some of them bore a signature that Jonathan could not immediately understand. One account belonged to a company Jonathan had never heard of. But there was a name he remembered very well on the payment. It was his wife, Sarah. Sarah, whom he had known for more than 30 years. Sarah, who had always been his loyal support. But was that really the case? Jonathan could not put off talking to Sarah any longer. It hurt him to think that she could be involved in something like this, but the fact remained. He wasn't ready to let it go unanswered. Sarah, we need to talk. His voice sounded firm, but at the same time it seemed like he was trying to keep his emotions in check. Sarah didn't answer right away, but just sighed heavily. Ashley knew that this would be the moment when all the secrets would come to the surface. She must have suspected for a long time that Jonathan would find out something. I've always tried to protect you, she said, looking down. But in this situation, I just couldn't do otherwise. It was best to keep things under control. Jonathan was ready to listen to her explanation, but his mind refused to accept what he was hearing. Do you really think this is okay, Sar? His voice began to tremble with frustration. You've been cheating on me, using my money without my knowledge. How could I not have noticed this before? Sarah was silent for a few moments and then sighed, as if admitting defeat. It's not what you think, Jonathan, but it was money I borrowed for our daughter. She was in serious trouble, and I was trying to protect her, but I didn't know how to tell you. It was wrong, I know, and I'm sorry. Jonathan felt his heart clench with pain. Now everything was clear. His whole family had been secretly taking money from him, manipulating his feelings and trust. Sarah had her reasons, but that didn't make the betrayal any less painful. You really couldn't find another way. He asked, trying to hold back his tears. Sarah sat silently, not knowing what else to say. She was deceived by her own love and fear for her children. Jonathan began to realize that this was just the beginning of a journey that was opening up a whole new world for him. A world where he was not the master of the situation, where all the decisions he made could be changed by someone else. And the worst part was that the one he loved the most was not the person he had imagined before. He felt trapped, and although at first glance the situation seemed resolved, deep inside he had unanswered questions. Who can you really trust in a world where everything you own is subject to manipulation? Jonathan did not know if he would ever be able to fully forgive Sarah, but he was sure of one thing: the real struggle was just beginning. All the plans he had made so carefully were destroyed in an instant, and now he was facing a difficult choice. Could he make sense of this chaos, or was it all too much for him? Jonathan sat in his chair, silently reviewing the documents that confirmed what he had long suspected. It seemed that every new day brought new shocks and even more unanswered questions. Every number on the account, every transaction began to look like another stab in the back. How did it happen that he became a stranger in his own family? The cost of family trust was not just a phrase, it was a reality that he was now experiencing. Instead of enjoying the well-deserved peace that should have come with retirement, he was a victim of his closest circle of people. And the most painful thing was that Jonathan could not understand when exactly this crack began. Was it one big blow, or had the crack gradually grown to this size? Jonathan could not understand why no one had told him about the situation his family was in. He looked closely at every receipt, every transaction, and they all seemed to lead to the same place. The accounts he opened turned out to be a deeper hole than he could have imagined. Before, he would not have even suspected that something was wrong with his finances. If it hadn't been for his own decision to check his accounts, he wouldn't have realized that his retirement savings were slowly disappearing, transferred to other people's accounts. I can't believe they're doing this to me," he said aloud, clenching his fists. "And now I don't know why I'm left without what I've worked so hard for all my life." After he found out that his wife and daughter had been taking money without his knowledge, Jonathan began to doubt even more every word they had told him before. And Sarah, with whom he had lived for more than 30 years, and Lisa, his own daughter, who had always meant the world to him. "Sarah, I can't let this go anymore. How could you do this to me?" He asked, looking at her with bitterness in his eyes. Sarah, sitting in front of him, lowered her head. She could not even try to justify her actions. All her attempts to look confident were pathetic, because inside she felt that she had betrayed the man she had lived with for most of her life. I didn't know how to tell you," she said quietly. Lisa was having big problems with money. We just couldn't leave her in that situation." She was at her wit's end, Jonathan sighed. His heart was heavy with pain. He knew that Sarah had acted in the best interest of her family, but it still didn't lessen the pain of her betrayal. "You had a right to tell me," he continued, almost emotionlessly. It's my money, and you had no right to make decisions without me. Why didn't you come to me and ask me? Why'd you think you could take my money and not tell me?" His voice trembled slightly with emotion. Sarah did not know what to say. She saw her husband falling apart, and it was hard for her. She did not understand why she had not come to him earlier. Perhaps it was hopelessness, or just fear of losing more. But now her fear of the possible consequences seemed trivial compared to what they had both lost: trust and intimacy. Jonathan realized that he could no longer rely on his family the way he had done before. The decisions he had made about their welfare no longer seemed wise enough. How could he be sure that no one else would do the same? How could he trust people who seemed to put their own interests ahead of his? Money was not the only loss. His trust was broken on a deeper level, and it was something he could not easily forget. He looked at his family. Sarah, Lisa, his son Ben. They were all sitting in front of him, but there was nothing familiar in their eyes. They were no longer the people he knew. All their actions, all their choices were now alien to him. Jonathan realized that he needed to find a way to recover. Maybe all was not lost, but he could not stay where he was any longer. He had to make a choice. Was he ready to forgive? Does he want to continue living with people he no longer trusts? This was the biggest question Jonathan was asking himself. He needed to find his purpose again. Despite all the betrayals and painful discoveries, he couldn't let it break him completely. The feeling that he had become a victim of his own family remained a heavy burden. But perhaps this was exactly what he needed to build a new life. But would it be enough for him? Jonathan sat in his chair, staring at his empty bank account, with his financial situation moving downhill fast. And his mood was no better, and he could no longer ignore the fact that his life was gaining speed that he would not be able to handle. Every day brought new numbers and even more stress. He didn't yet have the full picture of what was happening, but he knew one thing: the financial downturn he was facing was only the beginning. The problems were not limited to his retirement savings. It was much worse. And the more he realized, the harder it became to deal with the situation. All those years of trying so hard to save enough money for a comfortable retirement now seemed in vain. And every number in his bank account was no longer just a number. It was a reminder of a loss, a deception that he had failed to see in time. How did this happen? How did I allow this to happen? He asked himself, looking at the series of incomprehensible transactions that had now changed his financial future. Money was not just disappearing from his accounts, it was going to things he could not even imagine. No one had told him how much real life costs after you give up controllable expenses and let your loved ones do things you don't even understand. Yet he felt like a victim, but at the same time he was afraid that he might be left homeless, without money, without support. The first symptoms of the family crisis were just signals that he chose to ignore. Small financial problems that he wrote off as unexpected expenses or just misunderstandings of some family members. But now that he saw the bigger picture, it became clear that it was part of something much bigger. Jonathan began to realize that he was not just being stolen money, he was being betrayed from all sides. And what had seemed like a small loss before now looked like the result of a clear and planned conspiracy. The family was not just being dishonest, they were acting deliberately to rob him. And even as he tried to look for answers, each new revelation opened up even more questions. As time went on, he began to realize that financial problems were not just about money. They weren't just draining his accounts, they were draining his soul. Jonathan began to question his decisions, his ability to run his business and hold his family together. The frustration that his family was the cause of his problems haunted him constantly. He began to feel his emotions fading away, the support he so desperately needed disappearing. How did I not notice this before? How did I allow myself to be deceived like this? His internal dialogue seemed more and more depressing. Jonathan felt that his life was beginning to lose its meaning. He didn't know how to get back to the normal life he had worked so hard to build. Everything he was striving for seemed so fragile and vulnerable. The space around him had become too small, and every day reminded him more and more of his helplessness. Would he be able to overcome this? Would he ever be able to rebuild his finances and regain his former peace of mind? He didn't know. Jonathan's biggest fear was that he would never be able to get it all back. It seemed to him that he was on the brink, and that his future would depend on what he did now. And every day brought more disappointments, more questions that had no answers. For many years, Jonathan was very confident in his financial stability. He worked 2 jobs, saved money for a rainy day, and did everything he could to ensure that he would be secure in his old age. But now he saw that this whole foundation on which he had built his life was beginning to crack. He could no longer take life as usual. His dreams of a quiet retirement and a peaceful end to his career were illusions. Now that he is facing the consequences of his decisions, his outlook on life has changed. Jonathan felt that his financial decline was becoming not only an economic problem, but also a personal crisis. He no longer just feared for his retirement, he feared for his future. The decisions he had made in the past now looked extremely difficult. Was he able to believe in himself and his family again? Would he be able to regain what he had lost? He didn't know. Only one thing was clear: these changes were only the beginning. Jonathan sat in his old chair with his head in his hands. And his entire life, all the years of hard work and savings now seemed like nothing more than a meaningless game that was won by others, not him. He felt betrayed, not just by the money, but by the very essence of what had happened. The family he loved had deceived him, and now he had to question everything he believed in again. In the midst of all these difficulties, Jonathan felt that he had come to a critical moment. He was facing a difficult choice, or how to continue on, what to do with all that was left. He realized that his life would no longer be the way he had envisioned it at the time of his retirement. It wasn't just a financial collapse. It was the revelation that his family had not just made a mistake, but had deliberately manipulated him. What could he do? Did he have any right to choose whether to leave things as they were or to try again to build a new path? None of his decisions seemed right. Jonathan felt that every choice he made could lead to even more pain and loss. He imagined that every step he took increased the chance of even greater failure. Should he leave everything as it was or continue to fight for his future? The difficulties of his financial problems were only part of what he had to deal with. Doubts about his trust in his family and his own strength never left him. Was he too old to start over? Was there any point in trying again? One thing was for sure, his family was not what he had imagined. It was not just a financial betrayal, but an emotional one as well. Jonathan now realized that much of what was happening behind the scenes in his life was a deception. Those he trusted the most had taken advantage of his trust for their own gain. They knew his weaknesses, they understood his naivety, and that was the basis for their manipulations. Jonathan sat and recalled how many times he had told his children how important it was to work honestly and be responsible. Now he himself had fallen victim to this very unfair game. Due to his age, Jonathan was feeling more physically tired than ever before. The decisions he had to make were difficult, and his body could no longer withstand the strain of constantly worrying about his financial future. It was the moment when he realized that he could no longer act as he had before. His body could not withstand this pace of struggle. It seemed to him that time had long since run out, and he was no longer able to take any more stress. Maybe I can't do it anymore, he thought. But what if I don't try? What if I don't give up? Deep down, Jonathan realized that if he didn't make a decision now, it would make it for him. He needed to find the strength to at least realize which way was right for him. And although he no longer had the resources to move forward as he had before, he was willing to take at least some steps to turn the situation in his favor. He decided that what he lacked was not only finances, but also a sense of control. He had to regain control, at least over himself, at least over what was left. For Jonathan, the moment of truth had arrived. Looking at his pension balances was shocking, but he still decided he couldn't give up. He had to act to find another way for himself, for his life. And although this new path seemed unclear and even scary, he knew one thing: if he didn't do it now, he would never do it again. Leave it all behind or give himself another chance. Jonathan knew it wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't give up. He had to do it even if the outcome was unknown. With every step he took, his decisions became harder. And even though his body felt tired and exhausted, Jonathan's spirit was still strong. His determination indicated that these choices were necessary. And although he had no guarantee that the next step would be successful, he still had to go ahead. This is my choice, Jonathan thought, and I will live with it no matter what. With each passing moment, his confidence only grew. He began to realize that the most important thing was not to give up. And although he still had a long way to go, he now knew for sure that the choice, however difficult, was in his hands. Jonathan sat on the couch, clutching an old photograph of his children when they were young. He remembered how it all began, the moments when they laughed together, when everything was so simple and pure. And now everything looked completely different. Now it was just an illusion of happiness that he saw through the prism of his memories. His family, which was supposed to be his support in his old age, was now his biggest pain. All these years he had given it everything: his love, time, strength, finances, and it all disappeared like a flash when he learned the truth. It turned out that his children, who always seemed to care so much about him, were part of this scheme that had taken his life savings. Jonathan could not understand why this had happened. He even tried to find logic in their actions, but all his thoughts led him to believe that they had deliberately chosen betrayal over support. How could he be so wrong about the people he loved the most? There was no longer any desire to fight for something that no longer made sense. The hope that the family could change, that everything would return to the way it was, began to melt away. Jonathan felt that he could no longer rely on his family. Did he really need to live in a world where he no longer had family support? This breakup was not only a financial ruin, but also a ruin in the very essence of his existence. What do you do when the people you loved the most have deceived you? How do you even go on living when your entire reality is crumbling before your eyes? His children, without even trying to explain what happened, became cold and distant. Their silent reaction was even more shocking than the fact of betrayal. Jonathan tried to talk to them, to understand why it had happened, but every argument they made sounded like an excuse for their actions. "Apu, don't understand, Dad," his eldest daughter said. "It was our only option. You had so much money, we thought you wouldn't notice. It was not just a misunderstanding. It was a complete lack of respect, both for the father and for the very concept of family trust. How could he ignore his children? Why did they think that?" Jonathan didn't even know what to say. He was shocked and deeply hurt. Faced with the choice of forgiving his children for their betrayal or breaking up with them forever, Jonathan felt that both options would be painful. If he stays with them, he will always remember this moment of betrayal. If he cut ties, he would lose the last thread of family unity that remained. What to do when trust is no longer restored, and resentment becomes a part of every conversation and every meeting? He knew that no amount of forgiveness would change what had happened. Now he could not even see his family as they used to be. Maybe I am not capable of forgiveness. Perhaps I need to forget them all to at least maintain my dignity, he thought. Jonathan came to the conclusion that it would be difficult for him to cut all ties at once. He still loved his children. But every day of this betrayal was eating away at his soul. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew for sure that this story no longer had a happy ending. Even if he wanted to take it all back, it would be too late. The feeling of emptiness was deepening. He felt like he was a stranger to himself. Everything he had done for his family, everything he had given, now seemed meaningless and pathetic. The family ties that had once been strong were now crumbling before his eyes, and he could do nothing about it. The question he was asking himself now became extremely simple, and at the same time extremely difficult. Should he stay with the family that had betrayed him, or should he cut all ties and start a new life? At that moment, he did not know what he would choose. But there was one thing he knew for sure: these ties, which had once been a source of joy, had now become a heavy burden that he could no longer bear. Jonathan raised his head and looked at the empty space where his children had once stood. Nothing seemed important. Only one thing: whether he could survive this and make a decision that would change everything. Jonathan stood by the window, looking out at the huge garden that stretched to the horizon. The last few days, since he had learned the truth about his family, had been like a foggy dream. Everything was different. Everything changed, even the way he perceived his own home. This garden, which had once been a place of joy, now seemed alien and cold. Should I stay or should I go? Was the question that haunted him. He was on the verge of making a decision that could be final. His children, his family, whom he once loved above all else, had become strangers to him. They had betrayed him, and even when he tried to talk to them, when he tried to understand their motives, he received no support, no remorse. Only excuses and indifference. He was ready to say goodbye to everyone who had been a part of his life, but the question remaining: is he ready for this? Would he be able to survive this separation from everything he knew? Jonathan was breathing heavily. Memories of how he had tried to be a good father came back to him like a bolt from the blue. He was not perfect, But he always tried. Anyway, he had given his entire life to his family, working 2 jobs, saving on his own desires to provide for them. And now what? His children have stolen what he had been saving all his life. Maybe I just didn't realize that they didn't need me for who I am. They only want money, and that's not love. It's just use. Jonathan thought about it day and night. The very children he had raised and loved were now his enemies. Would it be better for him to leave them? Should he still try to salvage this relationship? He sat at the kitchen table, swallowing the last bits of his dinner, and tried to understand what had happened to his life. Though he couldn't get himself together to talk to them again, because every time he tried to do so, it brought him more pain than joy. The loneliness began to weigh on him. He felt cut off from everything that had once been important. No amount of money could bring back what he had lost. He was not prepared for this, to lose not only money, but also the connections that had been built up over decades. Or are they really worth staying? Was the question that kept coming back to him. Jonathan remembered how it all began. How they were little, how he had promised himself to always be with them, to support them. And now he felt betrayed. Was there any point in continuing to wait for changes that would never happen? Jonathan tried to find a way out of the situation. He was not ready to lose his entire family. But every time he returned to them, he felt that something had irrevocably changed. What had happened before no longer made sense. These shadows that haunted him began to take over his thoughts. He would get out of bed at night and not be able to sleep, thinking about what he should do next. Every day was like the lasting the days became the same, and even this huge house seemed empty. Only the sound of the clock ticking softly reminded him that time was running out. Maybe they are not worth my waiting for. Maybe I've been holding on to the idea of family happiness for too long, which doesn't exist. But what was left if he left? Only emptiness. Or could he become part of something bigger again, something he didn't yet understand? The choice stood before him like a huge wall that he had to overcome. And in each option, he did not find an answer that was accurate. Jonathan thought that if he stayed with them, it would be a daily pain that would remind him of his betrayal. If he left, he might be leaving them, but he would also be losing himself with them. The decision was difficult, but his heart told him that perhaps leaving everything behind was the only way. Perhaps he would have to go through this process of loneliness and abandonment in order to eventually find himself. And maybe, after all, the time has come for me, he thought, preparing to take the last step in his life. Jonathan was sitting on his old couch in his new apartment, which looked exactly as empty as his soul. He had been daring to take this step for a very long time, and today he left his old home, leaving behind everything he had ever considered stable. He left behind everything he had built up over the years, but most importantly, he left behind his family. The minute he sat there, immersed in the darkness of his room, without the comforts he was used to, without his family, without hope that he would find warmth again surrounded by those he loved. But perhaps time made him realize that it was all an illusion. Now I am alone, and there are no more promises, no more guarantees of what will happen tomorrow, Jonathan thought. He could no longer hide behind the promises of his children. It was a great illusion that someday they would be there for him, supporting him as they had when he was a child. Now everything was different. He was alone, and no one was waiting for him at home. No one was waiting for him to return. Jonathan couldn't help but think that his life was without guarantees. The people he had raised and loved had taken away what he had been saving his whole life. His pension, which he had counted on so much, was now just a vague dream. The one who was supposed to be his support, the one he loved, had turned into the person who destroyed his world. And now, in this empty apartment, Jonathan felt it was hard to take a step forward. How did I end up in this situation? How could they do this to me? Jonathan thought. He felt powerless in the face of what had happened. All his hopes for a secure old age were gone. He could no longer afford to think calmly about the future. a hand. This was the biggest blow he had ever received in his life. The space in the apartment was so large and empty that Jonathan felt every second of loneliness. There were no familiar smells, no noise brought by children, no familiar walls. He stood in front of an empty mirror that reflected only his lonely figure, and he could not find the strength to return to the life he once had. What am I going to do now? How can I find the strength to start over? These questions remained unanswered. There was no support, no one to understand what was going on in his soul. All he could expect from life was chaos and pain, and now, after everything that had happened, Jonathan felt that he could no longer rely on promises, on the opinions of others. Jonathan's life became like a dam that was flooding. Every day he became more and more vulnerable. The pension he had hoped for no longer brought him joy. After all, money is only a temporary security. What was next? How to find a way to continue living without the minimum security he was used to. Perhaps Jonathan could look for a new job, although that seemed completely unsuitable for a man of his age. Perhaps he should have returned to the dreams he had abandoned in his youth. But time does not stand still, and at his age, every day is already too much. No matter what happened next, Jonathan realized that he could no longer afford to live on other terms. He needed to adapt to the new reality. He could no longer rely on what had once given him a sense of stability. But even sitting in a dark room without the comforts he was used to, he felt that he still had a chance to find a new life. He realized that it was up to him how he would spend this time. It was his chance to reboot. And even if everything around him seemed empty and insignificant, he knew that he still had the power of choice in his hands. Perhaps all was not lost. Perhaps this moment is just the beginning of a new stage. To reconnect with his family. Find new opportunities for himself. Jonathan did not know, but he felt that every new day was a chance. And even if he was alone again, it would be his choice, not the result of someone else's decisions. Life without guarantees. He smiled, realizing that this phrase had become his new motto. Jonathan sat in the dark, looking at the empty walls of his new life. He never imagined he would end up here. And although this room was as unfamiliar as his current situation, he knew that this was last chance at something new. But what was really waiting for him? And is there a chance to change things for the better? The same questions kept running through his mind. How did he end up in this situation? All he had left were the memories of how, until recently, he believed in the stability and reliability of what he had built. But what he thought was far from reality. Every day he felt his idea of security and future crumbling. He thought about his children, about everything he had done for them. And now, instead of providing for his old age, they had taken away everything he had. His plans, his stability, his peace of mind, everything was destroyed. Now he is left alone with himself. And this lonely stare into the void was becoming increasingly difficult. Jonathan looked up at the old desk where some of his documents were lying. A letter from his lawyer, some papers related to his pension, documents about his new apartment. But with each new paper, his mind became more and more confused. Did it all make sense? Did he have any hope that he could rebuild his life? I guess I still believe that things can be fixed, he thought, not quite believing his words. It was a moment when he felt extremely vulnerable. He realized that he could no longer rely on his family, on the support of his loved ones. But he was not ready to give up either. Now that he had nothing to lose, Jonathan began to do things he could not afford before. He started looking for new opportunities, new ways. Maybe he still had a chance for a new life. Maybe he should reach out to old friends he hadn't seen in a long time, or start a new career that he had long tried to avoid. It was not easy. He may not have been young and had the strength he once had, but his resolve grew. One more step forward, one more attempt, one more decision. What do I have to lose? He thought. All that remained was to move forward, no matter how hard it was. He had no more time for regrets. What did the future hold for Jonathan? These questions remained open. He realized that no one would give him clear answers. There was no guarantee that he would ever recover his financial situation or regain the trust of his family. And he might have to live alone and without a definite future. But did that mean he should stop trying? He took a deep breath and looked into the empty room. His life had been filled with betrayal and pain, but he didn't feel like it was the end. Maybe it was just a temporary crisis, a moment when everything seems hopeless, but which will change for the better later. Emma can still start over, he thought, recalling moments in the past when he was full of strength and determination. He was ready to act, even if it meant starting from scratch. He realized that time was running out and that he needed to act right now. But how could he do that? How could he regain his trust in a life that had betrayed him? Start again. Is it possible? Jonathan asked himself. And again, as in previous times, he did not find an answer. And so, sitting in silence, Jonathan made an important conclusion for himself. His life was not over. Despite all the difficulties, he still had a choice. Although the future remained unpredictable, he was still left alone with his decisions. Maybe he could regain his trust in people again. Maybe he would find support again, or maybe he would just live on his own terms. This is only the first step, he said, and although there was no answer, he felt that he would have to go on alone. But is this the end? Will his journey still be full of surprises? We do not know the answer.